What if an empire that lasted 500 years controlled territories on 4 continents, enslaved millions of Africans, extracted gold and diamonds from Brazil, and monopolized the spice trade for a century collapsed completely in 48 hours because the soldiers protecting it simply refused to keep fighting? April 25, 1974, 4:30 a.m., Lisbon. A radio station plays Grandola Vila Morna, a song banned by the Portuguese dictatorship. This is the signal. Military units move into Lisbon, surround government buildings, and demand the regime resign. By noon, Prime Minister Marcelo Quitano surrenders. By midnight, April 26th, the Estado Novo dictatorship that ruled Portugal for 48 years is gone, and within months the entire Portuguese empire collapses. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé all declare independence. 500 years of empire spanning from 1415, when Portugal captured Ceuta in Morocco, to 1974 ends in 2 days, because the soldiers tasked with maintaining colonial control in Africa fought 13 years of brutal wars, watched thousands of their comrades die defending territories that generated no wealth for Portugal, and decided the empire wasn't worth dying for. This is the story of how Portugal built the first European global empire through maritime exploration and brutal extraction, why the empire lasted 500 years through slave trading and resource exploitation, how the final colonial wars in Africa bankrupted Portugal while enriching no one, and why the collapse happened so fast once enforcement cost exceeded extraction benefit and the enforcers refused to continue. The pattern is clear. Empires last as long as the wealth extracted exceeds the cost of military enforcement, and when soldiers refuse to die for extraction that doesn't benefit them, 500 years of empire can collapse in 48 hours. Let's start with how Portugal actually built the first European overseas empire and why extraction was the foundation from day one. 1415, Portugal captures Ceuta in Morocco, the first European colonial conquest outside Europe. But the real empire begins with Henry, the navigator sponsoring expeditions down the African coast from 1420 to 1460, searching for route to Asian spices and African gold. 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounds Cape of Good Hope. 1498, Vasco da Gama reaches India and returns with spices worth 60 times the expedition cost. Within 20 years, Portugal establishes the Estado de India, the State of India, a maritime empire controlling trade routes from East Africa to Japan. The mechanism was simple. Military force established fortified trading posts, Goa, Malacca, Macau, Mozambique, Hormuz, that controlled strategic choke points on trade routes. Portuguese warships patrolled the Indian Ocean enforcing the Cartaz system, a protection racket where any merchant ship trading in Portuguese-controlled waters had to purchase a Cartaz, a license costing 10% of cargo value. Ships without Cartaz were seized or sunk. This wasn't trade, it was extortion enforced by naval power. A Gujarati merchant ship sailing from Calicut to Malacca had to buy Portuguese permission to trade in waters that had been free for centuries. Portugal didn't produce anything, didn't improve shipping, didn't add value. They positioned warships at strategic points and charged for passage, pure extraction. The scale of the slave trade reveals the Portuguese empire's true foundation, enslaving and selling human beings. Between approximately 1450 and 1850, Portugal transported approximately 5.8 million enslaved Africans from Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, and other West African territories to Brazil and São Tomé plantations. This was roughly 46% of the entire Atlantic slave trade. Portugal moved more enslaved people than any other European power. The economics were brutal. Enslaved people purchased or captured in Angola for trade goods worth maybe $30 equivalent, transported across Atlantic in conditions where 10 to 20% died in transit, then sold in Brazil for $300 to $500 equivalent. 10-to-1 profit margin, and the cargo replenished itself through capture and breeding. São Tomé became first major sugar plantation colony, worked entirely by enslaved Africans in the 1500s, creating the model later expanded to Brazil. Brazilian sugar plantations in the 1600s and 1700s, Brazilian gold mines in the 1700s, Brazilian coffee plantations in the 1800s, all worked by enslaved Africans transported by Portuguese traders. Portugal's colonial wealth for 400 years came from enslaving Africans to extract resources from Brazil. When Brazil gained independence in 1822, Portugal lost the profitable extraction, but retained the African territories that had been sources of enslaved labor. These territories, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, became direct colonies producing resources like cotton, coffee, diamonds, but never generating wealth comparable to the slavery period. Portugal held them anyway because giving up colonies meant admitting the empire was dead. Brazilian gold and diamond extraction shows how empires strip colonies of wealth. 1695, gold discovered in Minas Gerais region of Brazil. Over the next century, approximately 1,000 tons of gold, 32 million ounces, flowed from Brazilian mines to Lisbon. This was the largest gold discovery since Spanish conquest of the Americas. Add several million carats of diamonds discovered in 1720s. Portugal should have become the richest country in Europe. Instead, the gold flowed through Lisbon to England. Why? The Methuen Treaty of 1703 gave England preferential trade access to Portugal in exchange for buying Portuguese wine. In practice, this meant Portuguese gold went to England to pay for British manufactured goods, British textiles, British ships. Portugal extracted massive wealth from Brazil through enslaved labor mining gold, and England extracted that wealth from Portugal through trade imbalance. By mid-1700s, British merchants estimated 90% of Brazilian gold ended up in England. Portugal was intermediary, doing the violent extraction work, while England captured the wealth. This pattern reveals the colonial hierarchy. England extracted from Portugal, who extracted from Brazil, who extracted from enslaved Africans. Multiple extraction layers, and the bottom paid everything. The independence of Brazil in 1822 was the first critical blow that began Portugal's terminal decline. Brazil was 90% of Portuguese colonial wealth. When Pedro I declared Brazilian independence, Portugal lost the sugar plantations, gold mines, coffee estates, diamond deposits, everything that made the empire profitable. What remained were African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé, that required military garrisons to control but generated minimal wealth. Portugal kept them because of imperial pride, because admitting the empire was finished was politically impossible for the monarchy and later the Estado Novo dictatorship, and because small colonial elite in Lisbon profited from colonial trade monopolies, even if Portugal as a nation didn't benefit. So Portugal poured resources into maintaining African colonies that lost money, impoverishing Portugal while claiming empire status. By 1960, Portugal was the poorest country in Western Europe, with per capita GDP half of France or Germany, yet spending enormous percentage of budget maintaining African empire that benefited almost nobody except colonial administrators and monopoly trading companies. The colonial wars from 1961 to 1974 were the immediate cause of collapse because they made the extraction enforcement equation impossible. 1961, Angola declares independence movement begins with armed revolt. 1963, Guinea-Bissau independence movement starts guerrilla war. 1964, Mozambique begins armed struggle. Portugal faces 3 simultaneous colonial wars across Africa. The Portuguese dictatorship, Estado Novo under Antonio Salazar then Marcelo Quitano, refused to grant independence, insisting the African territories were integral parts of Portugal, not colonies. So Portugal deployed military force. At peak, over 150,000 Portuguese soldiers were fighting in Africa. Approximately 40% of all military-age Portuguese men served in Africa at some point during the wars. The wars cost approximately 40% of Portuguese government budget annually. Young men were conscripted, sent to Africa, fought brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in jungles and savannas against MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. Over 8,000 Portuguese soldiers died. Tens of thousands more returned wounded, traumatized, or broken by wars that had no clear purpose except maintaining colonial control over territories that generated no benefit to Portugal. the soldiers knew this. They watched comrades die defending Portuguese privilege in Africa while Portugal itself remained poor, undeveloped, repressed by dictatorship that banned political parties, censored media, and imprisoned dissidents. The breaking point came when the enforcement cost, human and financial, exceeded any possible extraction benefit, and the enforcers refused to continue. By 1974, the colonial wars were militarily unwinnable. PAIGC controlled most of Guinea-Bissau. Frelimo and MPLA held large territories in Mozambique and Angola. Portugal was spending unsustainable amounts on military operations that achieved nothing. But more critically, the military itself, particularly junior officers who commanded troops in Africa, concluded the wars were pointless sacrifices for colonial empire that benefited nobody except corrupt dictatorship and colonial trading monopolies. Movimento das Forças Armadas, Armed Forces Movement, formed among captains and majors who'd fought in Africa. Their goals: end the colonial wars, end the dictatorship, establish democracy. They planned the Carnation Revolution executed April 25, 1974. Here's how 500 years of empire collapsed in 48 hours. 4:30 a.m. April 25th, radio station plays the signal song. Military units move into Lisbon. Key military bases join the. By 8 a.m., troops surround Prime Minister Quitano's offices. By noon, Quitano negotiates surrender with General Antonio de Spinola, one of the few senior officers supporting the coup. By midnight, the Estado Novo dictatorship is gone. Within weeks, political prisoners released, censorship ended, political parties legalized, and most critically, Portugal announces it will grant independence to all African colonies. By November 1975, just 19 months after the coup, all Portuguese colonies are independent. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé, East Timor all free. The transition was chaotic: civil war in Angola, hasty independence agreements, over 1 million Portuguese colonists and returnees fleeing Africa back to Portugal with nothing. 500 years of empire, from capturing Ceuta in 1415 to losing Angola in 1975, ended because the soldiers tasked with enforcement refused to enforce. The retornados reveal the human cost of sudden imperial collapse. Between 1974 and 1976, approximately 1 million Portuguese colonists fled Angola, Mozambique, and other former colonies. About 10% of Portugal's population arriving as refugees within 2 years. These were settlers who'd lived in Africa for generations, owned businesses, farms, estates built on colonial exploitation. They lost everything and arrived in Portugal, itself poor and chaotic during democratic transition, with nothing. Portugal couldn't absorb them economically. Unemployment spiked. Housing shortages became crisis. The retornados became underclass in the country that had sent their ancestors to Africa to extract colonial wealth. This is the pattern of imperial collapse. The colonists who benefited from extraction become refugees when the empire ends, and the metropole that sent them discovers it can't reabsorb them because the empire impoverished the center while enriching tiny colonial elite. Britain faced this with refugees from India, Kenya, Rhodesia. France faced this with Pieds Noirs from Algeria. Sudden decolonization creates humanitarian crises because empires are built slowly but collapse suddenly, and the human logistics of unwinding centuries of colonial settlement happen in months. The economic aftermath shows why the empire had been liability, not asset, for decades. Portugal in 1975 was bankrupt, government debt enormous from colonial wars, economy stagnant, infrastructure crumbling, population traumatized. But within a generation, Portugal transformed. Joining the European Economic Community in 1986 brought investment and development. Democracy stabilized. Economy grew. By 2000, Portuguese per capita GDP had doubled relative to 1974. Losing the empire made Portugal richer because maintaining the empire was draining resources. The colonies cost more to control than they generated in extraction, which is why the military refused to continue fighting. The empire had become pure cost with no benefit except pride and prestige for dictatorship. Once the military acknowledged this reality and refused to enforce, collapse was inevitable and immediate. This is the empire pattern that repeats and matters for understanding all imperial collapse. Empires last as long as extraction benefit exceeds enforcement cost, and collapse suddenly when that equation reverses and enforcers refuse to continue. Rome collapsed when legions wouldn't fight for empire that couldn't pay them. The Soviet Union collapsed when the military wouldn't suppress independence movements in republics. The British Empire collapsed when Britain couldn't afford to occupy India and other colonies after World War II bankrupted the country. Portugal collapsed when soldiers who'd fought 13 years in Africa decided maintaining colonies that impoverished Portugal wasn't worth dying for. The collapse always looks sudden: 48 hours for Portugal, 2 years for Soviet Union, 15 years for British Empire. But it's never actually sudden. It's decades or centuries of extraction that slowly becomes unsustainable as enforcement costs rise and extraction benefits decline, until one crisis breaks the equation completely and enforcers refuse to enforce. Portugal extracted for 500 years through slavery, gold mining, spice trade monopolies, and African resource exploitation. The extraction impoverished the colonies and didn't enrich Portugal because wealth flowed through Portugal to England and other powers. When maintaining African colonies required 40% of national budget and thousands of soldiers dying yearly for territories that generated no benefit, the military said no, and 500 years of empire ended in one coup that lasted 48 hours, from first troops moving at 4:30 a.m. April 25th to Quitano's surrender at midnight April 26th. The empire lasted 5 centuries. The collapse took 2 days. That's how empires end, slowly, then all at once. This is the empire economy, where we decode systems operating in plain sight, but rarely explained honestly. Portugal built the first European global maritime empire through naval power that enforced protection rackets on Indian Ocean trade, enslaved 5.8 million Africans shipped to Brazilian plantations, and extracted 1,000 tons of gold from Brazil that enriched England, not Portugal. The empire lasted 500 years because extraction exceeded enforcement cost. It collapsed in 48 hours when 13 years of unwinnable colonial wars made enforcement unsustainable, and soldiers refused to die for empire that impoverished Portugal while benefiting nobody except dictatorship and colonial elite. The Carnation Revolution was a military coup by officers who'd fought in Africa, recognizing the empire was dead. They ended the dictatorship and granted independence to all colonies in one decision that undid 5 centuries of colonial control in 19 months. 1 million retornados fled Africa as refugees. Portugal was temporarily devastated. Then, without empire draining resources, Portugal developed and prospered. The pattern is universal. Empires collapse when enforcement cost exceeds extraction benefit and enforcers refuse to continue enforcing. 500 years of Portuguese empire, 48 hours of collapse. That's how long empires take to die once the soldiers decide they're not worth defending.